suppose maybe part of the motivation is that there is so much resistance on the side of the member state governments and the European Commission to do something about this issue. It affects a lot of people. I can see that it also progressively affects people more as FATCA is being implemented. Well, I think, look, the European Parliament does not decide on taxation. That is a purely national competence of the EU member states. But I think the fact that the issue is becoming more and more visible, that the European Parliament has clearly put it on the political agenda now, I think that will be very helpful. We need to put pressure on the national governments. And this is clearly also something which, even if the European Parliament and the EU as a whole have no fiscal competences, it is clearly something that will come up in our broader talks with the Americans and with the US government. I don't know to what degree they will be open to our arguments, because for the US government there is very little direct interest to change this legislation. At the same time, these kinds of issues, you cannot see them in isolation. It is part of our relationship with the United States, part of the transatlantic relationship. So if there is an issue like this, which is clearly irritating from a political point of view, then I think it is also in the interest of the United States to do something about it and make sure that we keep our transatlantic relations in good shape. Of course, everybody can see that the relations are strained. The visit of President Trump to Europe in the last couple of days hasn't really, let's say, improved things. In a way, ironically, that may actually be helpful because it will also make European governments more aware of the fact that they cannot just have blind trust in the American government to do the right thing, and that we need to be a lot more assertive and also speak up for our own European citizens. I'm not sure that we're going to find quick solutions to this. It is very much a matter of, on the one hand, putting pressure on the United States, on the other hand, also putting pressure on the national governments in the European Union. I think we also need to make sure that those governments who have taken an interest in the topic, notably the Dutch and the French governments, that they push harder to get it onto the agenda of the Council, where all the national governments are represented. So, and we have to look at this from different perspectives, from the angle of let's say fiscal rules, the fact that there is a general rule that people should not be taxed twice, from the angle of transatlantic relations, from the angle of data protection, from the angle of fundamental rights and non-discrimination, equal treatment of citizens. So there are all these different angles, and we have to work them all at the same time. I think with regard to a timetable, it is very difficult to say, because and I don't want to create any expectations that we cannot meet soon, because chances of convincing the US government to change their tax system in the short term, I think, are very, very slim. I think we need to take a step-by-step approach and try to get at least some sort of relief, maybe by way of exemptions or facilitating, in any case, for accidental Americans and other US persons who are affected, facilitating the process. I think that would be an initial step, make it less difficult for them. And I also think that inside the European Union, we have to also put pressure on financial institutions, for example, and say, look, we realize that you have to deal with FATCA, that it's difficult, but it doesn't mean that you can just exclude people as customers. I also think it would be better if, instead of the bilateral intergovernmental agreements that we have now, we would have a single agreement between the United States and the European Union, because as an EU, we simply carry more weight in the negotiations. the European data protection laws do not allow data to be transferred from the European Union, let's say outside the European Union. So if a bank, for example, sends data to the United States tax authorities, they are violating EU data protection rules. So what they did is they asked the national governments for help, and then the national governments have concluded an agreement with the US authorities so that it's no longer the banks here in Europe that are transferring the data, because the banks, let's say, give the data to the national governments here in Europe, and then the governments transfer the data to the tax authorities in the United States. It's a bit of a scam, really. It's just legalizing something which is otherwise illegal. These bilateral agreements do not serve the purpose of data protection. So I think they should be repealed and ideally replaced by an EU-US agreement that meets all the European data protection standards. Very, very important is awareness and putting pressure on, well, national politicians, essentially, because I think this issue has now really been taken up by the European Parliament. I mean, for years, I felt that it was difficult to get support from my colleagues because they simply didn't understand what the problem was. But now it's clear to everybody. The European Parliament has really embraced it, is throwing its weight behind it, keeping it on the political agenda. But it's very important that national politics also respond and that they become aware. And there I see that national governments tend to be a little bit timid and reluctant to raise difficult issues with the American authorities, which is strange because there are only two countries in the world that have a citizen-based taxation system, and that is the United States and Eritrea. And when Eritrea was doing the same to its citizens here in Europe, then Europe was very quick to respond and tell Eritrea off. So it is also a matter of attitude, and I think Europe should be a lot more assertive. And if we have to deal with a president that says America first, well, then we should put our European citizens first. I think what is also very useful, if all those people who are affected, and I think we are probably talking about hundreds of thousands across the European Union, to get organized and to unite and to speak with a single voice, because I think that makes the movement much more powerful. Access to a basic bank account is a right which has been laid down in law in the European Union. So that at least you can claim. You can tell your bank, you cannot exclude me from a basic bank account. That's a right everybody has. We have legislated on that. Other financial services like a mortgage loan or getting a credit line for your business, that's a more difficult one because there is no legal right to that. I think what you should do is consult a lawyer or a fiscal expert and also talk to your national authorities and ask them what the best course of action is and make sure that you get, let's say, legal backing there. A first important step has been taken by putting it so clearly on the agenda. Next week, it will be raised in our transatlantic meetings in Washington. If we manage to get the member state governments to do the same, to also raise the issue with their American counterparts, then, I hope that in the foreseeable future that we can find solutions and solve people's problems. To be frank, I think the Americans don't care. This is not their problem. And I think they have adopted this legislation for reasons of their own, and they seem to think that, and it also reflects very much the approach they have in other policy areas as well. They're not terribly concerned with what people think. They're not terribly concerned with transatlantic relations, and I have to say, if I look at the behavior of the American president, there is no way of telling what the American government will do, not even by next week. They're extremely unpredictable. Of course, at the same time, let's say the institutions in the United States are still there. It's still the same civil servants, and they're still functioning. It's not as if Trump is running everything on his own. But this is clearly not a very easy situation. So I think it is still, I mean, we have to, on the one hand, use every transatlantic meeting that we have to put this on the agenda. On the other hand, I think our prime focus should be the national governments in the European Union, because they hold the key. Well, first of all, they have their bilateral contacts with the American authorities. They have, for example, concluded these international agreements. So they have these contacts already, and they should use them to push for solutions. Ideally, the abolition of this silly citizenship-based taxation. I mean, that would be the best, of course. But also, if all the member states together in the Council of the European Union, if they put this on the transatlantic agenda, then they can really exercise a lot of pressure. I think this is also something that national governments will raise in the OECD context, because there too, there are, let's say, global rules on taxation. For example, they have a lot of rules on, or let's say, common programs for fighting tax evasion. That FATCA was initially perceived by the European Commission and by the member states as something positive, as a way of fighting tax evasion. And of course, fighting tax evasion is a good thing. I mean, we can all see how much damage it does if big companies in particular, or very rich people, do not pay taxes. And I think many people were kind of blind to the side effects. One of my colleagues, Brian Hayes, who's from the EPP group, the Christian Democrat group, he used to be a Minister of Finance at the time that the Irish American intergovernmental agreement was negotiated, and he actually says that. He says, our intention was to fight tax evasion, and he said only afterwards I understood what the downside of it was for individual citizens, and he is very committed now to mending that, basically. But I don't think that the average American citizen has any idea, and therefore it's probably not an issue that would ever play a role, for example, in an election campaign. It's not as if, I don't know, Trump would have to fear for his re-election if he maintains citizenship-based taxation, because it doesn't, many people probably don't care. So it's really for the EU as a whole to exercise pressure on the United States. And the best way of achieving that is raising awareness, joining forces, and making sure that the national governments throw their weight behind this. And you can count, I think, on all the major groups in the European Parliament to support this cause, because I think by now everybody is aware, is convinced, and we will do whatever we can to keep it on the agenda.